Summer's here, the roads are packed, and accidents can happen in an instant. If you've been injured in a car accident, don't get stuck fighting the insurance companies alone. Fight back with one call to Azari Law. Call 888-828-HURT. That's 888-828-HURT. At Azari Law, we've proudly fought for the DMV community for over 15 years. I'm attorney Lauren Kalekis, born and raised right here in the DMV, and my team and I are ready to fight for you. Injured? Don't wait. Don't settle for less than you deserve. With offices in Maryland, D.C., and Virginia, Azari Law is standing by to help accident victims get the justice and compensation they deserve. This summer, protect yourself and your family by knowing who to call when life takes an unexpected turn. Call 888-828-HURT, 888-828-HURT, and let Azari Law fight for you. Follow us on social media at azari.law. That's AZARI.law.
Finding the right furniture for my home can be hard, especially when I'm looking for trendy, high-quality pieces that won't break the bank. Luckily, at Bob's Discount Furniture, I can shop the latest styles and customer favorites with tons of 5-star reviews, like Bob's Real Marble Elm Dining Set, which has over 600 5-star reviews. The Copper Radiance Mattress, which over 400 Bob's customers say will give you 5-star sleep. The Ultra Comfy Phantom Reclining Sofa, which boasts over 1,000 5-star reviews. And the customizable modular Bob's Sectional, which not only costs just $250 per piece, but has over 1,700 5-star reviews. So when you're ready to score 5-star style for every room in your home at everyday low prices, listen to the smartest shoppers around and stop in or shop online at Bob's Discount Furniture, where America shops for furniture.
Hello, everyone. On today's AFSA podcast, we're sitting down to chat with Dr. Garet Lahvis, who we're really excited to have here with us today. Garrett is a former professor of behavioral neuroscience at Oregon Health and Science University in Portland. He has degrees in ecology and evolutionary biology, natural resources, toxicology, and immunology. He's published over 40 scientific papers and was the recipient of 2 literary awards, as well as a Pushcart Prize nomination. He's best known for his work on social emotions in mice, such as empathy. But in discovering their social and emotional capabilities, he slowly began to question the relevance of animal studies when lab animals are confined to cages and the psychosocial implications of living like this. His career then took a drastic turn when he decided to abandon animal research altogether, arguing that the lab animals' unnatural living conditions makes them unreliable models for research of human health. He's now even writing a book for the University of Chicago Press about it. So Garrett brings a very unique perspective to the table today, and we've been looking forward to asking him about it. Welcome, Garrett.
Well, thank you for having me. I think this is an exciting opportunity to talk about a very important topic.
Tell us about your personal experience in biomedical research. How did you transition from a key neuroscience researcher to abandoning research science altogether?
So my path through biomedical research didn't really start with neurosciences, and that might have been a good thing. As you mentioned, I started with research in natural resources, and I was interested in the time with animal awareness. My question then, whether deer would choose to run from a coyote all the time, or rather they would make a decision about when to run. Because if they ran all the time, they might die of starvation, especially through the harsh winters where I studied them, which was in Montana in the United States. And if they didn't run it at all, of course, they would die of predation. I found that actually they make choices about when they run. They do run at an optimal distance that allows them to survive. But I turned from that to asking, I think, more practical questions. At least I thought so at the time. I wanted to know how pollutants harmed wildlife, because we have so many pollutants in the environment. At the time, there were 70,000 different kinds of chemicals that humans were producing and putting in the environment. And I was interested in what they were doing to animals and to human beings. And over the years, then I got degrees in toxicology and then a PhD in immunology, where I was asking questions about how pollutants affected the immune system in animals. I studied dolphins in the Gulf of Mexico and found a correlation between PCV levels and their weakened immune responses. And in that process, I started to realize that while we can study things broadly in the wild, we need experiments to understand causal relationships. If you do one thing to an animal, what will happen? And I thought that was important at the time because without understanding what pollutants cause what, we couldn't really get rid of the really bad ones. So I turned to studying mice in cages and became quite interested in how pollutants affected first their vascular system, more mostly their vascular system in development, and later with the rise in autism, the rising prevalence of autism in humans, how that might affect aspects of autism like social reward and empathy, which are known to be challenged in children with autism. I thought I could understand how that would work in mice. So we started studying social reward and empathy in mice. And that's when I really started to see how neuroscience was failing, both, I think, human health and science in general. So where things started to change for me was when we started to develop tests that could measure social reward in mice. What I mean by that is we came up with a method whereby we could see or we could infer that they derived pleasure from a social interaction with another mouse. In that experiment,
Testing season is right around the corner, and this is when confidence really matters. When kids take time to review key concepts and strengthen their skills before assessments, it can make all the difference. IXL helps reinforce what they're learning right now, so they walk into every test feeling prepared, capable, and confident. IXL is an award-winning online learning platform that helps kids truly understand what they're learning. Whether they're building math confidence, strengthening reading and writing skills, or reviewing science concepts. Designed for students from pre-K through 12th grade, IXL delivers personalized, interactive practice that adapts to your child's level and pace. It's an easy, effective way to support learning as the school year heads into its final stretch. Studies show kids who use IXL score higher on tests, proven in all 50 states. IXL is used in 96 of the top 100 school districts in the U.S. Make an impact on your child's learning. Get IXL now. And listeners can get an exclusive 20% off IXL membership when they sign up today at IXLlearning.com/audio. Visit IXLlearning.com/audio to get the most effective learning program out there at the best price.
Nerds! Today's episode is sponsored by NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast. Personal finance can feel like a pop quiz you didn't study for. This podcast is your study guide. On NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast, you'll hear from trusted journalists who explain the why behind major financial decisions. You'll get research-backed insights and clear pros and cons, whether you're planning a big purchase or just want to grow your wealth. Make your next financial move with confidence. Follow NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast on your favorite podcast app.
It became clear to us that they actually have a sense of well-being that they can make decisions from. And in this way, it was a sense of well-being about being in a cage with another mouse, and that they would make decisions to be in environments that we paired with those experiences. What that told me was that these animals they're capable of acting on their decisions, acting on their feelings, acting on the environments that they live in, that they could put value on social interactions and find less value in being alone. And that indicates that they have feelings about how they live. And that was kind of an eye-opener because we were looking at lowly mice. We weren't looking at rats. We weren't looking at all the various monkey species, certainly not apes. We were looking at a fairly simple creature. At least we thought so at the time. And I think that changed my mind pretty dramatically over the years about what I was doing to these animals, which had been up to that point fairly substantial, invasive work. I started to see them more as creatures that deserved some level of dignity and I hadn't given it to them before. So I think that was the beginning of the reason that I left neuroscience. But obviously there was much more to that.
Right. I imagine it was a process.
Yeah, I think a lot of the process came also out of on the more philosophical side, of the more, I guess, the ethics of it. And I guess I'd like to open that door a little bit. So when we began doing biomedical research, which really started, I think, in earnest probably in the 1920s. We had some big successes. I mean, it was then that insulin was discovered. It was that was done from experiments on dogs. Penicillin was discovered, and as were vaccines with studies of mice and monkeys. And those discoveries were huge, and they continue to be paraded, I would say. Because their successes led to so many improvements in human well-being and animal well-being as well. But a lot of those studies were fairly old, and they didn't require an animal to have a healthy, robust psychological state. They didn't. If you look at the insulin, which is produced by the pancreas, you didn't need necessarily a healthy, happy animal to have a insulin-secreting pancreas. But today the questions are a lot different. We do a lot of experiments on animals that I think require a healthy state of mind, and a lot of them have to do with mental illness. For example, looking at what I looked at, autism, but we studied monkeys and rodents to understand ADHD and schizophrenia, addiction, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. All of these challenges that humans face are nuanced, and they require, if we're going to study them in animals that would otherwise not be necessarily depressed or frustrated or inadequately developed by living their lives inside cages. And then you can couple that with research even in other areas like immunology or cancer research, where we know that a healthy psychology in humans can be very important in cancer survival. We know from studies in humans that a healthy frame of mind can be quite important for cancer survival or a healthy immune response. And yet we also dismiss the reality that animals in cages don't necessarily have that healthy mindset. So a lot of our experiments are potentially skewed, and indeed studies have shown that they're skewed because animals in small environments are not that healthy. And they're probably not that healthy in part because their psychology is warped by their confinement.
At Lowe's, we're about to kick off something epic for fans who want more messy. And trust us, you'll want to be a rewards member when it happens. Join for free and get access to messy exclusives, surprises, and more. Head to Lowe's.com/more messy. Now's the time to get in because members get more at Lowe's. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Visit Lowe's.com/terms for details. Subject to change.
Presented by T-Mobile, the official wireless partner of Odyssey Sports. With an awesome network and great savings, there's never been a better time to join T-Mobile. Visit your neighborhood store to make the switch today.
So I guess I could say that if you just look at some of the data on how animals live in laboratories versus how they live in the wild, you can get an idea of the extreme confinement that these creatures undergo, so that we can study them. So I could talk about like the size of their spaces. We can talk about the volume, or we can talk about the square footage. And I will talk about the square footage, but I don't want to leave the false impression that size is the problem for these guys. I think they also, inside a cage, they lack day-to-day challenges to overcome. Every day is the same. They don't have different weather patterns. There's very little that they can do or use their minds to understand. But if we just look at the space they're in, it's pretty amazing how little is afforded to them. So take a rhesus macaque, which is a common monkey used in research, or a monkey commonly used in research. A rhesus macaque gets a cage that's about 2.5 feet across. So in many instances, they can touch both walls at the same time, okay? In the wild, they navigate a range of about 1.5 square miles. So this would be the equivalent of about 740 American football fields. But they get a space that's about twice their height and about the width of a refrigerator.
And I might just jump in there, Garrett, and add that in Australia, there are actually no set guidelines for standard cage sizes for non-human primates. And what we've seen from our investigation, at least, is that the majority of cages for non-human primates end up being approximately the size of an average washing machine. And they're allowed to have 2 in there at a time.
Right. And this, we know we use these animals because they are relevant to human health, right? We use monkeys because they're most like humans, except for apes. They're presumably most like humans. Yet we absolutely know without any question that short of capital punishment, housing in confinement is about the worst thing you can do to a human, save torture. Yet, we don't question the space we give these animals and how it affects their development and their mental state. What I cannot understand fully is how scientists who are paid to question reality, they're paid to question how the world works, cannot question whether it makes sense to study an animal that's that significantly confined. Oh, and the same goes for mice. I mean, we're still talking about mammals. We haven't moved to the vast number of other species that are out there, but they're also substantially confined. So they travel an average home range. That means like every day they're moving around in an area of about 5 basketball courts or 50 parking lot spaces, about half an American football field, yet they get a shoebox. They get a laboratory shoebox. If they're afforded running wheels inside those shoeboxes, they run about 8 kilometers a day. That's equivalent of about 24,000 cage lengths in a single day. And so again, how mentally healthy are creatures that are naturally used to moving huge amounts of areas relative to their body size to be housed in cages like that.
Yeah, and I think also one of the things that really sticks out for me is that over the years, we've appreciated how multifaceted mental health conditions and neurodegenerative diseases actually are, with all sorts of factors playing into their development, from the environment to their diet to their socialization, all these other things. And we're essentially eliminating so many of those factors by assessing these animals in a laboratory setting. Essentially, what that means is that we're not accurately replicating those conditions.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, for a long time, I felt that what we need to do is give animals a lot bigger environments with a lot more options, and a lot more to overcome, a lot more challenges to overcome. But in many of the kinds of questions that we ask as scientists about conditions that are optimal for humans, that might lead to a better outcome with disease, they're fairly tightly focused on specific conditions that are very difficult to replicate in any kind of environment for an animal. For example, Something I worked on for a little while was failure to thrive in children, and how some children under this extreme duress of, let's say, having parents that are addicted to drugs don't do well. They may not do well, so they may not be all that socially interactive, for example. So and what I mean failure to thrive, I mean in that sense that they may not thrive in social settings because they didn't grow up in a healthy environment. Something like that would be very difficult to model with an animal in a cage. I do want to say, having said that, that obviously there's an awful lot we've learned from animals in cages, even in modern times, just the relationships between their genetics and their biology, their development, their various physiological systems. But what I'm saying here is that as you move from an animal model to a human being, when you don't factor in the environmental differences, or when you choose to ignore them deliberately, the relevance of those animal models becomes much more suspect, because it's you have to factor in the pain and suffering that these creatures are going through in these tightly confined spaces.
Yes, and I think you wrote it really nicely in one of your articles. I'm quoting now. You've said, "The cruel irony is that the ethical justification for experimenting on animals, that they lack subjective experiences, allowed us to find cogent evidence that they do. Now we're forced to ignore what we've learned from science so that we can keep doing it." So I think that really sums it up quite nicely. Why do you think that scientists and researchers have ignored or resisted both the growing evidence of animal sentience and the lack of transitional value of animal models for so long?
I think part of it is that we're just human beings. I think in some sense, science has opened the door to probably, at least in Western culture, a fairly old idea that humans were like made in the image of God, or were especially sentient and had cognitive abilities that were, categorically different from all other animal species. I mean, Darwin took a lot of heat just for saying that we evolved from other animals. So part of it is that I think science has made a huge contribution in identifying how many commonalities we have with other animal species. But we're kind of, I think, as a species, hitting a hard reality. And that reality is that we can't continue to think that these animals are so different from us. Scientists have to face this reality almost first. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that they're the most intimate with the data. We see the physiological data indicating that, or information indicating that we share similar physiologies. We're just like humans and rats get addicted to drugs for the same reasons. We share the same anatomy or neuroanatomy with other mammals. And we share behaviors that indicate similar levels of psychological experience. So we have to we need to deal with this reality, and we're not. I think scientists are also have a difficulty because we're trained to be objective and to be reductionist, which means objective means having being somewhat untethered from.
Would you look at that? It's time for some of our favorite Snapple Real Facts. Real Fact 1433, toe wrestling is a competitive sport. Real Fact 732, the chicken is the closest living relative of the Tyrannosaurus Rex. And Real Fact 1599, a man once ate an entire airplane. Youch. Did he have any hot sauce? Yeah, so anyways, this has been a refreshing break brought to you by Snapple. Real tea, real juice.
With Snaps, it's refreshing!
Or how you feel emotionally. And reductionist meaning we look at the littlest things. We look at smaller and smaller mechanisms. And if you put those two things together, you can't look at the subjective feelings of the animal that's looking back at you, the whole animal that's looking back at you. I mean, I felt this for years. I mean, I would be working on how different genes might affect how a cell develop, or how a blood vessel develops in the liver. I wasn't looking at the mice in the cages that had those livers, that had that blood vessel that carried that gene. I couldn't see it because I was focused on something else. But I also think humans as a whole have a strong interest in not recognizing animal subjectivity. I mean, it's not just science, but we consume vast amounts of energy and destroy the environments of other animal species just for travel. We eat them. We not just eat them, and that may be okay in some ways. But the way we house them, the way we make them suffer before we eat them, we somehow, many humans think is okay. I think it's, and in that sense, I think humans give other humans a pass because the harms they cause are indirect. That, if I fly in a plane from here to across the United States, I don't see the death that causes. I don't see how the climate change that might cause affects some animals somewhere in the environment. I don't see that. But we do see how an experimenter who sticks a probe in an animal's skull is directly affecting that animal. So I think that I have big ethical concerns, which I would be happy to discuss, about animal experimentation. But it's not, I think, that scientists are unique in their exercising harm on other animal species. I think they're it's that they're part of a culture that has no problem with it, despite what we know from science.
Right. It's we've discussed this in previous podcasts about cognitive dissonance in different animal industries. So, for example, having the happy smiling cow on the milk carton, and people growing up with these cultures and traditions, doing things with animals, eating animals, using them in one way or another, and not even realizing that it can potentially be cruel, not seeing the exploitation for what it is or the suffering because they just don't know any better. And even if they could, it's very easy for them not to because they don't have a direct hand in any of this. You go and you buy the finished product from the supermarket. You don't have to go and do, those steps that come beforehand. But what does stick out to me in contrast in research settings as opposed to those other industries is that, so like you said, with food, for example, a lot of people would believe that eating animals is okay because you need to eat to survive. In research, what we're doing with animals, the cruelty, it's quite intentional. So, for example, like you can be doing a study where the aim of the study is to look at like models of pain or tissue regrowth after some sort of injury, or cognitive functioning after brain injury. And so you're actually intending to cause harm to the animal so that you can study it. Whereas in other industries, it's probably more of a consequence of having it so industrialized and commercialized at such a giant scale. Whereas those like family-owned farms, for example, might do things in a more ethical way because they have the capacity to do so. But in research, the cruelty and the harm is actually very intentional.
Well, I see your point, but I also don't know if that's how it felt when I was doing the research. I feel like when we're doing experiments on the animals, I think there is a fair amount of focus on giving them the appropriate anesthetics, etc. Not in all cases, but for the most part. And I think also there is a relationship, which I'd like to get into, but there's a relationship between the harm you cause and the harm you're hoping to reduce. And it gets into the idea of the ends justifies the means,
Right.
which humans use in all kinds of ways, including the harming of animals. But we get involved in wars pretty routinely, at least in the United States, with the idea that somehow the long game is important, that the result is more important than the harms we cause along the way. And obviously, humans and animals suffer in the process of some supposed goal that is seen as more valuable. So I think it's within the human capacity to think that way, that extends beyond scientists. But I think there's another problem, and maybe my issue isn't with that, what you brought up, though I like what you brought up as an idea. I think that for the most part, researchers are trying not to harm the animals when they do experiments on them, and maintain a healthy dose of, or maybe egregious dose of cognitive dissonance in the way they house them. But I think the bigger ethical issue, or at least the ethical issue that bothers me most, has to do with this. The predominant, in fact, I think the only argument I have ever heard why we do biomedical research, or what the ethical justification for doing biomedical research is that the ends justifies the means, that the suffering we reduce in the future justifies what we do to the humans and animals along the way. And I'm going to put humans in here because there have been many experiments that have been done on humans that have also caused immense amounts of suffering. So the ends justifies the means. So I have a few issues with this. The first issue is that science is inherently a human practice which works on the premise that we do not know the ends. We do not know what will happen. We do an experiment to find out what will happen. We do not do experiments to show what we know will already happen. So in that sense, the ends don't justify the means, or at least they don't mostly. We're working in a system where it's not about that. In some kind of collective sense, sure, somebody might come up with the next insulin, or way to get a vaccine, or something. But from one scientist to the next, for most of us, we have nothing to show for our research with respect to alleviating human or animal suffering. So the ends don't usually justify the means. But that's the argument we use to justify animal and human experiments. So if, though, despite my qualms with using that ethical argument, we're going to use that ethical argument anyway, then I believe that we should absolutely consider the implications of the research that we have done or are doing. And the implications of the research that we have done shows that animals have psychological experiences based upon what we know of their physiology, their anatomy, and their behavior. We can make those inferences. So if we purposefully or inadvertently ignore that body of work, then those experiments are not justified. They're not justified if nobody pays attention to them. And I think that's where my concern is greatest. By not attending to the implications of our data, we completely destroy any justification for doing it at all. And that, I feel, is a moral problem, because in other areas of human endeavor, like farming, like using animals for food, in science, there, if we ignore our own data, there is no positive benefit for humanity if it's even only to feed them. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's really interesting. It's a spin to that argument that I've not yet heard before.
So I think, and ultimately that's why I left, because I could see the suffering of these animals in small cages, and I couldn't see how it was justified because nobody would pay attention. I do want to say this. The question then could be, are scientists deliberately ignoring the inferences we can make from looking at how their brains operate and the behaviors that they produce? Or are we just inadvertently ignoring that? And I think it's both. I think one thing to consider is that biology is a massive field. I mean, there are people that study renal physiology and liver metabolism and muscle function and cardiology and lung function, and they're obviously not going to be attending to what happens in the animal mind. But neuroscientists, I think, have that obligation. And I think they're in a tight spot because they know, I think a lot of neuroscientists know that if you truly acknowledge the implications of our work to date, there are some moral implications to the work we do. And I think rather than build on our knowledge, they'd rather just ignore it. And that is a breach of their professional obligations, at least if they know about that work.
Right. And I've seen also on your website, you've written, our practice remains stagnant despite what we've learned. So within the research community, or I should say within the scientific community, research is nonetheless very respected. So how did your colleagues react to your departure from research and academia? And have they been receptive to you and the arguments that you're trying to convey?
Oh, it's a difficult question to answer because there were so many different kinds of responses. My colleagues at work mostly thought that I should just keep doing mouse experiments because my lab was good at it. We were successful. We had lots of papers and we had done some really good work. And I'm thankful of that, but the general advice I was getting is, just put in the discussions of your papers, write down some of your misgivings about the kind of work you're doing, but keep doing the work. I did get emails from people around the country, some from overseas, not a lot, but who would congratulate me for my courage for speaking out. A few mentioned that they agreed with me, but that there's no way we could afford animals the space they need and still stay solvent. That basically it was just too expensive to do the experiments in the right way. In the department where I worked, there was also a lot of upheaval at the time, so I think there was just a lot of concern about that. I can also say we can get to a little bit of the culture of science. It's extremely difficult, I think, to maintain a lab, to keep getting grant money, to teach, to get your research right, to get the right interpretations of the data. There's so many pressures that if somebody speaks out, says, "Hey, maybe we need to do things differently," it kind of gets lost in the noise of a person's day. They can't. I've seen this multiple times where other scientists, I'm not alone, have spoken up to the idea that animals are more psychologically complex experiences than we give them credit for, and that maybe we should do things differently, or at least that's implied, and that just gets ignored. It gets ignored because there's just so much else that's involved in surviving as a researcher.
Yes, and we've written about this as well on the AFSA website about this. I think it's been called the publish or perish culture within research.
Right. It's strange because in an environment where society is paying people to think and reflect and push human knowledge forward, these pressures to produce and survive and the fear that goes along with that, I think can shut down that awareness, can shut down not only the awareness of the implications of one's work, but the awareness of the monkey or the mouse looking through the cage at you while you're working on them. I mean, it's a kind of a dumbing down almost that's institutionally and fostered.
Yeah, and I think that's seen globally as well.
It's unfortunate because we're working with very vulnerable animals and yet completely blind to their vulnerability, at least at a psychological level.
Yes, or perhaps desensitized.
Yeah, and it's kind of incongruent with what you would think of as a scientist. I remember, and I won't reveal his name, but I remember a person saying, was quite high up in academia. He said that he thought that scientists were a perverse lot, that this was like a perversion. And I just don't, I think that, I'm sure that's true for some people, but I think in large part, it's just not true. It's just there's so many aspects of being in biomedical research that can blind you to the fragile creatures you're working with and how their fragility can and their experiences as these captive animals can skew your data. You just can't see it.
Yeah.
This episode is made possible by animal-free science advocacy supporters. If you would like to help support the podcast, go to animalfreescienceadvocacy.org.au.
Has anyone ever actually implemented your advice or perhaps consulted with you about improving the conditions for animals used in laboratories?
Well, a little bit. Not much. And I don't know to the extent of it because it's not like people are like writing me back and saying, "Hey, I took your advice," right? So, but I want to put a shout out to Georgia Mason, professor from the University of Guelph, who did an extensive analysis that showed that with animals housed in small cages, they show much greater sensitivity to just about everything we do to them, whether it's genetic or toxicological manipulations, that they're much more feeble than animals in even larger cages with more things to do. She did a huge meta-analysis on that. And so I know she contacted me afterwards, and so I think at least I might have had something to do with either inspiring or those experiments, or maybe just galvanizing her motivation to do them. I'm not sure, but there has been work done since my efforts. And I published first in scientific journals to get the word out. So I think it's out there. I think I have made an impact, but unfortunately, I think the impact is coming is more on the outside than it is on the inside for the reasons that I mentioned. I think people in general who have some ethical concern for how we treat animals are more likely to be aware of some of the scientific and lay audience publications that I've written than people within my own field.
Yeah. And since speaking out against the research industry, have you encountered any obstacles with employment as a neuroscientist?
Oh, I knew that was going to end. That no, it. I mean, yeah. I think speaking out was absolutely meant that I was out. There was no. I mean, who would hire a person that's? I mean, if you look at the way in which we're set up, I couldn't go into an academic department that had neuroscientists in it, because almost every neuroscientist that's working with animals is working with them in small cages. I would be seen as a threat to the way they think. Nor could I bring in grant money to study animals in small cages, because that would be hypocritical. Nor could universities or colleges build large enclosures so that I could study them in bigger environments that were healthier, because that's a huge expense. So there's that door had, once I came out, even just in scientific journals, that door was shut for me. There was no possibility that I could go back into neuroscience.
Wow. That's a massive cost to you personally.
Yeah, I 2 master's degrees and a PhD, postdoc for 5 or 6 years, all in service to the belief that science would ultimately always solve problems, because it addressed reality in a humble fashion without preconceived ideas, and then to see that, no, that's actually not how it always works. It works that way a lot of times. But when it comes to how we see the animals we study, there's a hard stop there. And science is having a very difficult time moving past it.
Yeah, and it's really disappointing that the institutions weren't able to look at you as, a highly educated, intelligent person who's exercising critical thinking and trying to think outside of the box to advance human health outcomes, and yet couldn't give you the opportunity to run with that. They couldn't give you that chance. That's quite shocking.
And it seems like it should be shocking on the I mean, maybe I'll start that over. That I could see how that would be shocking. But on the inside, it's a different story. On the inside, at least in the United States, working in a medical school, the bottom line is the grants we bring into the institution. So if we don't bring in grants, the institution doesn't have the money to support us. So if I can't bring in grants to study mice, and I don't have a track record in studying, let's say, humans, or like say children with autism, to go into something else, I'm not bringing in money to the university. And at the end of the day, that's what matters most.
Yeah, and that ties back in with what you were talking about earlier about the ends justifies the means, because here you're potentially opening the door to new findings and new studies and new assessments, new insights into these mental health conditions that haven't been looked at in this way previously, and yet not. How do I say this? They've essentially prioritized the money over those ends. They have an opportunity to do so in an unprecedented way that could potentially advance human health further than it has before, but still go back to these old ways for the sake of money.
Right. And, in that sense, I'm grateful to have had a very old school Czech PhD advisor who he mentored me that scientific research was not a career. That is, foremost, you think of it as it's a way to make money. you're never going to be making the kinds of contributions that you need to make as a researcher. He said that science was a life, that ultimately it was doing the right science that mattered most. And in taking that to heart, I went in this direction, and ultimately, I think I reached that fork in the road. Do I continue to bring in grant money? Because I'm the expert in what I do, and I could basically pull the wool over everybody's eyes if I want to, and keep arguing that the research I'm doing is valuable for treating, for maybe finding a cure for autism or drug addiction. Or I can be honest with what I was beginning to see as truth and speak to that and lose my career in the process. And I'm quite glad I actually took that second route.
Yeah. And then looking back at the research papers that you've written, what sort of value do you think that they have? Do you think that their findings justified the experiments that were carried out on the animals involved and their living conditions?
I think that's a terrific question. And I'm glad you asked that. With respect to understanding the mice, I think to understand that the creatures that I worked with could feel pleasure to be in the company of other mice, or that they could feel empathy for the pain that I caused other mice, is important. And I think it's important to me. It's important to know that, at least in a Western culture. But it's important so long as it's known. So if it's not known, if it just gets thrown under the rug, then it was basically just an exercise in tinkering with mice. But if we acknowledge the implications of that and ask ourselves, are these creatures more sentient than we thought? And what are we going to do about that? Then I think that experiments are merited, which goes back to the ends has to justify the means here. I think with respect to understanding autism and human health conditions, I think it's a much bigger stretch to think that even under the best of conditions, what I learned is going to help us find the pollutants that might cause autism or the genes. Now, maybe maybe some genetic mutation will be associated with a loss of empathy in mice, but because of our experiments. But I think that's a much bigger reach. So I think, again, if I don't know how many thousands of papers are produced each day in biomedical research or each week, but to the extent that we just flood the market with papers and don't really read them or think about their implications, I don't know how much anything I've done or anybody else has done is really worth it, except in some fairly uncommon instances, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I'd like to ask something different now. So in Australia, every study has to be first reviewed by an animal ethics committee before it can begin. Now, in America, this is called animal care and use committees. So what has been your experience with those committees during your career? And did you feel that they were adequately scrutinizing your research applications?
Oh, yeah. So I actually worked at an IACUC for a little while, Animal Care and Use Committee. So I don't know how it is in Australia, but we don't review animal protocols until after they've received a funded grant. So let's say an investigator writes a grant for $5 million, and it involves a whole bunch of animals, and they don't get it funded. We don't see it. The Animal Care and Use Committee does not see it. But if they do get that $5 million award, then that award comes to the university pending an IACUC review of the animal protocol. Now, I think any person with common sense would see that there's a conflict of interest there, that any board that's part of a larger institution that's about to make $500 or $5 million is not going to, might not look too closely at the animal welfare situations in those labs. Having said that, I think they do okay with when it comes to physical harm. When we go back to like anesthetics and those and how animals are treated when an experiment on them is happening. But I think there's no incentive to look deeper, to look at questions like how they're housed. Because that's going above and beyond essentially the very, very basic. And without an incentive to look at how they might feel about their captivity and how that might affect their experiments, and at the same time having a huge incentive to approve the grant because it brings in money to the university, you get, in my view, something of a rubber stamp, because the psychology is not considered, at least not at much of a deep level. And that just seems okay with IACUC.
Yes, and research has also shown that the majority of times that someone has expressed concern within an animal ethics committee, majority of the time, that person on the committee is actually the lay person.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true in my experience as well.
Yeah. And unfortunately, we've also seen a lot of those same people experience intimidation after having raised concern. So obviously that puts into question the whole purpose of the animal ethics committees.
Right. And I think, too, there needs to be something in this institutional review that asks whether existing conditions are adequate. Just because a shoebox has been used traditionally for mice doesn't necessarily mean that it's appropriate for mice. And likewise, a refrigerator-sized cage for a rhesus macaque. It seems like there should be some place in the biomedical research complex where those questions are legitimately raised, earnestly raised. And an IACUC could be one place for that.
Yeah. In terms of young scientists who are starting out their careers, or perhaps have just started and are struggling with various ethical issues associated with their work, what advice would you give to them?
My first advice is listen to yourself, listen to your heart, listen to your instincts. If you're going to become a scientist, you should use all the information you have available to you, not filter out information because you think it might be anthropomorphic to wonder whether an animal has an emotion or is capable of reasoning. We know that both can be true of other animal species. We're not the only one that has those capacities. I think you should also consider that there's multiple ways to answer questions, and that honestly, biology is so huge and so complex that if you didn't do animal research, there's probably things you'll never know without doing animal experiments. But there's also an enormous amount you can learn by looking at alternatives to animals. and I can go on at length about how using non-animal models can afford you opportunities to look at how a vast number of different chemicals might affect a biological system rather than, one mouse at a time kind of analysis where you have to wait for the animals to grow up and then you dose them and then you have to wait and see what the response is. When you have these little cellular systems, you can just collect data at a vastly different scale and speed. I also think that there's a huge amount we can do by looking at animals in the wild, specifically when it comes to looking at how pollutants affect humans and animals, by looking at creatures that live downstream of pollutant sources and see what kinds of effects they have. I mean, they're dying at huge rates. In many cases, we can find out what they're dying of and then see if the local human populations are suffering from the same kinds of maladies. I think there's a lot you can gain from that. And I know in that respect that those would be kind of survey kinds of studies where we're looking at, we're not looking at cause and effect. We're looking at kind of relationships between, let's say, exposure to pollutants coming from a paper mill and maybe malformations in bird wings or something like that. But then you can go back to the lab and look using, again, these animal alternatives, these high-speed, high-throughput in vitro models. You can maybe quite rapidly find out what chemicals in those mixes are causing these kinds of problems. I think there's a vast amount of information we can gain by using different approaches than just putting animals in cages and exposing them to one chemical at a time or manipulating one gene at a time. That can give us lots of information that, when coupled with these kind of survey monitoring approaches with in vitro computational approaches, can maybe open our eyes in ways that we haven't had them open before. So I say, listen to your heart and open your mind, because I think science, we need a new way, and I think there's a lot to be gained through new kinds of science.
We would definitely agree with that. Now, I hear that you're writing a new book for the University of Chicago Press, and that this book argues that scientists need to recognize the psychosocial experiences of animals for science to advance. Can you tell us a little bit about your book and how you think this should actually be implemented?
I think some of that, I think I answered part of that in the answer to the last question. I think the implementation would be, I think in part that, but maybe I'll start it with this instead. At the end of the day, I think scientists need help. I think part of the reason that I was able to walk away from science is that over the last 20 years, with the successes I had in my own research, I became convinced that I need to learn how to write to the public, to a broader audience than my scientific colleagues. So I took writing classes, which is an exercise in learning how to access how you actually feel about things as opposed to what you think about things. I learned a lot I learned to acknowledge actually that I had feelings about how I treated the animals that I was studying. And I think the wisdom that came out of that is that a background in the humanities, or even the world at large, would be hugely helpful to scientists. Most of my colleagues went to college and studied, for the most part, science, which is how little parts interact, especially within biomedical research, how little parts of the body interact with one another, whether it's genes or cells or organs, physiologies. And then they went to graduate school to focus on some small part of that, and then spent the rest of their life studying that small part. So in a sense, then they're quite vulnerable. And in their kind of lack of understanding maybe of what I've come to see mostly since I left research a few years ago, that there's a lot of other parts to being a human than just studying how biological mechanisms work. And I think then the solution is that the public, and I know that's a broad group of different kinds of people, but I think the idea should be to help scientists get through this impasse. And I think that means help them recognize that subjectivity is also important. That maybe at an institutional level, we maybe back off the idea that we're going to get drugs instantly. Often in the case of like psychiatric drugs, we've had almost no success at all in the last 50 years. So that might not be that big of a risk. And maybe for the public to just let scientists go through the process of figuring out what to do next, given that we do know that the animals that are in their cages may have pretty strong feelings about being in those cages. I think there's some compassion that needs to happen all around. Compassion of scientists towards their animals, compassion of scientists towards themselves, compassion of non-scientists towards the difficulties and maybe blindness that scientists are suffering from, whether it's self-imposed or not. I think the future lies in maybe having some compassion all around.
Those are very meaningful words, which we agree with wholeheartedly. I have one last question for you, Garrett.
Sure.
You've spoken about non-human primate research. We touched on it a few times in some of our previous questions. And it's something that AFSA is working really hard at the moment to advocate against, that non-human primate experimentation. So in Australia, the guidelines for the use of non-human primates in research differentiates between great apes and other primates. Now, great apes essentially have more protections than other primates because they are genetically closest to humans. Do you think that there are significant differences between them in terms of their sentience, emotional processing, and issues with captivity and living conditions? Perhaps that we should recognize the sentience in all primates equally? What do you think about those guidelines?
It's a really hard question for me to answer, in part because I'm not a primatologist, but I do understand from primatologists that I've heard of from that apes have more mental capacities than the other primates. Having said that, I could see there is a greater philosophical question. I mean, that going along your lines of questioning that, fruit flies might be somewhat sentient too, or mosquitoes. Where do you draw that line, or do you draw that line in many places between humans and mosquitoes? How do you cross that territory? And I still don't have an answer for it, but I wonder if the question could be, what is the value of studying monkeys at all if you think they're so closely related to humans after apes that they're worth studying more than, let's say, mice or rats, when despite that argument you treat them worse than you treat convicts on death row? Like, how do you mentally make that leap from they're just like us to they're undergoing living conditions that are absolutely punitive, and we're going to study them as if they were like us under those absolutely punitive conditions? I think That's the question I would like answered. And in that framework, it doesn't really make sense to me to be studying primates at all, or at least it should be very carefully justified for some extreme cases to use primates when there's no other option, if that's even a thing. But man, it doesn't make logical sense to be studying creatures under these conditions to understand situations that are relevant to human experience.
I feel like you've hit the nail on the head, and left us so much room for thought here. So I think we'll leave it at that, because we could probably talk about everything we've discussed today for hours. Garrett, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. We hope that hearing about your unique experience will be inspirational for other researchers out there. And if anyone is interested in hearing more about Garrett's story, watching one of his talks, or learning about more about his work, you can find all of this in our show notes. And for any other information, head to the AFSA website. That's www.animalfreesci.org.au. Thanks for listening.